Tokyo, July 1945. The city no longer exists as a metropolis. It is a smoking geographical scar, where once there were neighborhoods of wood and paper, where life pulsed in narrow alleys. Now there are only plains of gray ash and the calcined skeletons of concrete buildings that refuse to fall. The air has a permanent taste of carbon and burnt fat. American B-29s, those silver beasts glistening in the summer sun, fly so low and with such impunity that one can see the sun's reflection on their polished fuselages. They no longer bring just incendiary bombs, they bring leaflets, papers that fall like dirty snow, warning which cities will be erased next. But the true war, the war that will decide the fate of millions, is not being waged in the skies, nor in the bloody trenches of Okinawa. It is being waged in two stifling rooms, separated by an ocean and an ideological abyss. In Tokyo, in the Imperial Palace's underground shelter, the Obunko 6 men gather. They are the Supreme Council for the direction of the war. The air down there is recycled, damp, and heavy with the weight of wounded pride. On one side, the War Party, led by Minister of War Korechika Anami. He is a samurai in a modern suit, a man who believes that the extinction of the Japanese race is preferable to the dishonor of unconditional surrender. He wants Ketsugo, the decisive operation. He wants to arm every woman, child, and elderly person with bamboo spears to bleed the Americans on the beaches of Kyushu until they beg for a truce. On the other side, the Peace Party, led by Foreign Minister Shigenori Teiji. He sees the ashes outside. He sees the hunger in the eyes of the population eating sawdust mixed with rice. He knows the war is over. The Imperial Navy is at the bottom of the sea. The Air Force is composed of suicide pilots and planes made of plywood. Teiji has a plan. A desperate, ironic, and tragic plan. He wants the Soviet Union, which still has a neutrality pact with Japan, to act as a mediator, to negotiate an honorable peace with the United States. Japan believes Stalin can be bribed. They are willing to hand over Manchuria, southern Sakhalin, anything, in exchange for the survival of the chrysanthemum throne. In Moscow, Japanese Ambassador Neotech Sato is the loneliest man in the world. He knows the truth that Tokyo refuses to see. The Russians will not help. Sato sends frantic telegrams to Teiji. His language is direct, brutal, stripped of the usual flourish of Japanese diplomacy. There is no hope, he writes. Surrender is the only way out. But Tokyo responds with delusions. Keep trying. The emperor desires peace, but not unconditional surrender. What Sato and Teiji do not know is that they are screaming into a megaphone, not speaking on a secure phone. Thousands of miles away, in Washington, American analysts with tired eyes and cups of cold coffee read every word. Operation Magic broke the Japanese diplomatic codes, the Purple Code, years ago. President Harry Truman, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, and Admiral Leahy have the transcripts on their desks before the recipients in Tokyo even receive them. The United States knows. They know that Japan is on its knees. They read the desperation in the July telegrams. They read the crucial phrase, His Majesty is anxious to see the end of the war. They know that the only real obstacle, the only latch preventing immediate surrender, is the Japanese fear that the Americans will execute Emperor Hirohito and destroy the Kokutai, the imperial national polity, so that this record is not lost like ashes in the wind, and the truth about these days of deliberate blindness is preserved. Leave your like as if signing a pact with the truth and subscribe to the channel, becoming a sentinel of this story that has only just begun. However, Washington's silence is deafening. Why ignore the extended hand, even if it is trembling? The answer is complex and cold as the steel of a bayonet. American policy has hardened. War propaganda has painted the Japanese not as military enemies, but as a subhuman plague that needed to be eradicated. The American public, fueled by Pearl Harbor and the atrocities of the Bataan Death March, demands blood, not negotiations. Unconditional surrender has become a religious mantra. Accepting any condition, even the preservation of a ceremonial figure like the emperor, would be seen as political weaknesses. Furthermore, there is a new player on the board, Stalin. The Americans know the Soviets are moving troops to the east. The window of opportunity is closing. If the war does not end quickly, Stalin will invade Manchuria and perhaps Japan itself, claiming a piece of the occupation just as he did in Germany. The United States does not want to divide Tokyo as they divided Berlin, and there is the thing, the gadget in the New Mexico desert. Scientists are about to test a weapon that makes diplomacy obsolete. Tokyo continues to burn. Ambassador Sato continues to beg Soviet bureaucrats who ignore him or give him cold tea and vague answers. And in Washington, powerful men read the intercepted pleas for peace, file the papers away, and look at the calendar. They are not waiting for the Japanese surrender. They are waiting for the weather to clear over cities whose names still mean nothing to history. Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki. Japan is trying to surrender with honor. The United States is preparing to destroy the very concept of Japanese honor. The mismatch is not linguistic. It is existential. And in the midst of this diplomatic silence, the doomsday clock begins to tick louder than the air raid sirens. The tragedy is not that Japan wanted to fight to the end. The tragedy is that they wanted to stop, but did not know how to say it in the language of total humiliation that the enemy demanded. And the enemy, hearing everything, decided that total humiliation was the only acceptable price. July ends, not with a whimper, but with a clinking of crystal glasses at the Sicilienhof Palace in Potsdam. Outside, a shattered Berlin still smolders, the smell of death and dust hanging in the air. But inside, the big three, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill, soon replaced by Attlee, are redrawing the map of the world on white linen tablecloths. The atmosphere is electric, but deceptive. Stalin, in his marshal's uniform, smiles like a cat that's cornered its prey. He knows Japan is desperate. He knows his armies are already moving east. He wants the spoils of Asia, but something has changed in the American camp. On July 16th, President Truman received a cryptic message from the New Mexico desert: babies satisfactorily born. The meaning was simple: the atomic bomb works. The fire of the gods was now in an American crate. Suddenly, the need to have the Russians join the war against Japan evaporated. Truman no longer needed to share the glory or the territory. He held God's own hammer in his hand. The American stance hardened instantly. Diplomacy became pure theater. On July 26, the Potsdam Declaration was broadcast to the world. It was a biblical ultimatum, demanding the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces. It promised stern justice for war criminals. It promised that Japan would not be enslaved as a race, but would be disarmed and occupied. And it ended with a sentence that sounded like distant thunder: the alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. But the most important part was what the declaration didn't say. It made no mention of the emperor. There was no guarantee that Hirohito, a living deity to his people, wouldn't be hanged like Mussolini. For the Japanese mindset of 1945, this wasn't a detail, it was an unbridgeable abyss. In Tokyo, the declaration landed like a grenade on the Supreme Council's table. The peace faction, led by Foreign Minister Teiji, saw a glimmer of hope. The declaration demanded unconditional surrender for the military, not the nation itself. But the military hardliners, led by General Anami, saw only a trap. They demanded immediate rejection. They wanted to fight until the last Japanese man, woman, and child bled out on the beaches. The government decided to buy time. They were still clinging to a delusional hope that Stalin would mediate a peace deal. They didn't know that Stalin was, at that very moment, signing the orders to invade Japanese-held Manchuria. So, the Japanese cabinet decided to ignore the Potsdam Declaration for now. Not reject it, but leave it hanging in the air until they heard from Moscow. And this is where linguistics becomes a historical assassin. The Prime Minister, Kentaro Suzuki, an elderly and weary man, was cornered by the Japanese press. Reporters demanded a position. What was the government going to do about the Allied ultimatum? Pressured by the military to be tough and by the diplomats to be vague, Suzuki chose a single, fatal word. He said the government's policy would be one of makasatsu. Now, makasatsu is a treacherous word. It's made of two characters: silence and kill. It can mean to ignore, to treat with silence, or no comment for now. When in its most aggressive interpretation, it means to kill with contemptuous silence. Suzuki meant the former: no comment, we are still thinking. But international news agencies don't have time for nuance. The translation that flashed across the Reuters and Associated Press teletypes was this: Japan rejects the ultimatum with silent contempt. In Washington, the headline hit the papers: Japan rejects surrender. For Truman and his advisors, the door slammed shut. They didn't see a divided, desperate government trying to save face. They saw arrogant fanatics spitting on an extended hand. Japanese ambiguity was read as absolute defiance. The moral debate in the Oval Office stopped. The machinery of death was activated with a cold flick of a switch. The target list, debated for months, was finalized. Kyoto, the ancient cultural capital, was spared by Secretary of War Stimson, who admired its beauty. Hiroshima, a compact industrial and military city, rose to the top of the list. It had been intentionally spared from conventional firebombing. The Americans wanted a blank canvas to test the power of their new weapon. They wanted to measure the exact radius of annihilation. On the island of Tinian, in the Marianas, activity became feverish and secret. The 509th Composite Group lived in isolation, surrounded by barbed wire. They flew special B-29 bombers, stripped of their machine guns and modified with special bomb bay doors. On August 5th, the final order arrived. There was no hesitation. Colonel Paul Tibbets chose his plane, B-29 number 82, and had his mother's name painted on the nose, Enola Gay. The thing was rolled out from a climate-controlled hangar. Little boy, a 4.5-ton monster, painted black and green. Inside, rings of enriched uranium-235 waited for their critical moment. The bomb wasn't loaded like normal ordnance. The plane had to be parked over a special pit, and the weapon was hoisted into its belly, like a parasite entering its host. The pilots played poker in the barracks. They knew it was a big mission. but few understood the physics of what they were carrying. They thought it was just a super bomb. They didn't know they were carrying the bottled sun. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, life continued with the miserable routine of war. The radio played military marches, women trained with bamboo spears. The government was still waiting for that telegram from Moscow, completely unaware that the Red Army was already fueling its tanks on the border. The blindness was total. They were looking north, fearing the Russians, while death was flying in from the east at 30,000 feet. The tragedy of Makazasu is the tragedy of pride and failed communication. If Suzuki had simply said, "We are studying the proposal," would Hiroshima still be standing? Maybe, maybe not. The inertia of war has its own gravity. The bomb cost $2 billion. There was immense political pressure to justify that expense. But that one wrong word, at that one wrong moment, removed the final safety catch from the weapon. Night falls over the Pacific. The Enola Gay starts its engines, its propellers slicing through the humid tropical air. Tibbets waves from the cockpit window. He carries cyanide pills for the crew, just in case they are captured. Diplomacy has failed. Words have failed. No physics will speak, and the voice of physics will be a roar that melts skin and vitrifies bone. Japan sleeps, dreaming of a negotiated peace that has already died on a translation table half a world away. If this story made you think, leave a like to show you were here, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to explore these critical moments in history together. Thanks for watching. Monday, August 6, 1945, Hiroshima wakes up under a porcelain blue sky. It is a hot day. The air raid sirens sounded early, but it was cancelled. People emerged from shelters, streetcars rattle. Students marched to dismantle houses to create fire breaks. The city breathes a sigh of relief. The solitary B-29 high above, glistening like a sliver of silver, is dismissed as a weather reconnaissance plane. No one runs, no one hides. At 8:15, humanity's clock stops. There is no sound in the first instant. There is only light. A light that does not belong to this world. A bluish white, purer and crueler than the sun itself. It does not illuminate. It erases. The shadows of people are burned into the asphalt and stone walls, permanent silhouettes of lives that evaporated in a millisecond. Then comes the heat. 4,000 degrees Celsius at the hypocenter. Birds burn in mid-flight. Granite melts. Human skin, exposed to thermal radiation, sloughs off the muscles like wet gloves. And only then, seconds later, does the sound arrive. The roar is not an explosion. It is the universe splitting apart. The shockwave levels the city like a giant hand sweeping a chessboard. Hiroshima ceases to be a city and becomes an open-air crematorium. Where there were 70,000 people, now there is silence and fire. Survivors, blind and deaf, walk like sleepwalkers toward the rivers, arms extended in front of their bodies to prevent raw flesh from touching their own clothes. They dive into the black water to drink and die right there, clogging the canals with swollen bodies. In Tokyo, the National Radio Control Room notices that the Hiroshima station has gone off the air. The telegraph lines are dead. The high military command is confused. There was no large bomber raid, they say. They send a pilot to investigate. 100 miles away, he sees the cloud. The mushroom, dirty and majestic, still hangs in the stratosphere, a tombstone of smoke over the grave of a metropolis. But the Japanese tragedy does not end with fire. It deepens with denial. For 2 days, the Japanese government tries to comprehend the incomprehensible. They debate. Physicists are sent to measure radiation. It is an atomic bomb, they confirm. Even so, War Minister Onami and the hardliners refuse to yield. The Americans cannot have many of these, they argue. They will not dare to invade if we fight to the death. The final illusion is shattered in the early hours of August 9th. Not by another bomb, but by a telegram. The Soviet Union declares war. TGS strategic nightmare becomes reality. Stalin's T-34 tanks cross the Manchurian border like an avalanche of steel. The Kwantung Army, the elite of the Japanese forces, is overrun. The hope of Russian mediation, the only diplomatic lifeline, turns into a hangman's noose. Japan is trapped in a pincer. Nuclear annihilation from the sky and communist invasion from the sea. And then, at 11:02 that same morning, while the Supreme Council discusses the Soviet invasion, Nagasaki is erased. Fat Man, a plutonium bomb even more powerful than the first, misses the central target but devours the Urakami Valley. Another 40,000 souls ascend in smoke. The Supreme Council room in the Imperial Bunker is a cauldron of despair. The news arrives in fragments of horror. Hiroshima destroyed. Manchuria invaded. Nagasaki in flames. And yet, the deadlock persists. 3 votes for surrender, 3 votes for continuing the war. Military honor demands national suicide. Logic demands survival. An act is required that breaks 1,000 years of protocol. Prime Minister Suzuki, bowed and weeping, does the unthinkable. He asks the emperor to decide. Hirohito, a small man with round glasses who was raised to be a silent god, stands up. His voice trembles, but his words cut the Gordian knot of history. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer any longer. The time has come to bear the unbearable and suffer the insufferable. He chooses surrender, but the war does not want to die. Young fanatic officers, led by Major Kenji Hatanaka, refuse to accept the divine order. On the night of August 14th, they launch a coup d'etat, the Kyoyu incident. They invade the imperial palace, kill the commander of the guard, and turn the complex upside down. They are not looking for gold. They are looking for a vinyl record. The recording of the emperor's voice, made to be broadcast the next day, is hidden in a stack of documents in a simple safe. The rebels' eyes, bloodshot with madness and swords drawn, run through the corridors screaming for loyalty while they set fire to the prime minister's house. If they destroy the record, the war continues. But the darkness of the palace protects the secret. The coup fails. At dawn, Hatanaka commits seppuku ritual suicide in the plaza in front of the palace. His blood stains the stones, the last useless sacrifice of a war that is already over. At noon on August 15th, Japan stops. People gather around radios in bombed-out factories, train stations, and roofless houses. The national anthem plays, and then a high-pitched formal, an archaic voice emerges from the static. It is the first time in history that the Japanese people hear the voice of their emperor. Many do not understand the words. Hirohito uses court language, complex and dissonant. He never uses the word surrender. He says that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He speaks of a new and most cruel bomb. But the message is absorbed by the silence of the kneeling crowds. The weeping begins slowly, then spreads like a wave. It is not just sadness. It is the physical collapse of a nation that held its breath for 4 years. It is over. The gods failed. The sun is set. American ships enter Tokyo Bay weeks later. The signing of the surrender on the battleship USS Missouri is merely a formality. The true surrender happened in the ashes of Hiroshima and the freezing solitude of Manchuria. Official history will say the bomb saved lives by shortening the war. Others will say Japan was already defeated and the bombing was the first act of the Cold War, a warning to Moscow. But for those on the ground, for the mother holding a charred child, and for the soldier who watched his emperor become human, geopolitics do not matter. What matters is that silence, the damned Makusa II, cost the highest price any nation has ever paid. Diplomacy failed because proud men on both sides refused to listen. 2. The whispers of peace until they were drowned out by the scream of annihilation. Today, the shadows of Hiroshima have faded on the asphalt, but not in memory. The modern world was born there, in the light of that flash. We live on borrowed time that began when the atom was split. What remains are only echoes and shadows. If you carry the weight of what you have heard, leave your like as your final seal on this memorial, and subscribe to the channel so that the next chronicle finds fertile ground in your memory. The sky is clear now. The broadcast ends, but the warning remains etched in the invisible air we breathe.